afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Space Civilian GPS. My name is Jean Ellis, and I'm a member of the Mahone Bay Chapter. We would like to acknowledge that we are in Mi'kmaq, an unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. The territory is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. This series of treaties did not surrender indigenous land, resources, or sovereignty, but instead established rules for an ongoing relationship between nations. We recognize the significance of these treaties and the need for continual learning and engagement in the work of truth, reconciliation, and equity. We are all treaty people. We also recognize that African Nova Scotians are distinct people whose history, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of the Latin known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. Just a few housekeeping points. Our fire exit is out to the left, the door. Our kitchen is just across the hall. And we will be having a 15-minute break, about an hour into the lecture. And complimentary tea, coffee, and cookies will be available. SCAN is a volunteer-based registered nonprofit organization dedicated to providing affordable, non-credit academic courses for seniors. We have expenses associated with putting on these free public lectures and presentations and would welcome any donation. We do have a donation jar just outside of the kitchen in the hallway. We will be having a question period at the end of the lecture, and we would ask that everybody save their questions and save the question period for now. And also we are recording this lecture, so please speak loudly and clearly when you ask the question. I would also remind you at this time to please make sure your phones are turned off. So now I would like to introduce our lecturer. Ken Johnston has had a long career working in the Royal Canadian Air Force, the Royal Navy in Scotland, and as a space and GPS instructor at the Canadian Forces School of Aerospace Studies in Winnipeg. As a GPS expert, he has worked for our DND on the Sapphire Space Surveillance Team and consulted for the U.S. Joint Navigation Warfare Center. He has been the president of KTEC Space since 2015, specializing in GPS interference research. Thank you, Ken.
When I first pitched the idea of Fern about doing a presentation of space computing and GPS, I kind of thought, we'll see what the interest was. That was back in about the Christmas time frame. And one thing she said is, you have to make sure it's not too technical. So, having said that, about 6 weeks ago, I gave a presentation in Calgary at the Canadian Technical Security Conference, which was pretty technical. And about a year and a half ago, I gave a presentation on a bunch of research I did kind of coming out of COVID, and a presentation I did in Montreal with the Canadian Aeronautical Space Institute. That was pretty technical. So if you've got a technical question, I will try my best to answer those, but I try to make the presentation not too technical kind of overall. Some of you probably, like if I could queue up CDC for this presentation, it was almost perfect. You might have known about a month ago we had a geomagnetic storm, which is the result of a storm that happened on the sun. G5 level storm, the biggest that we've seen in over 20 years, which impacts GPS, satellite communication, HF communication, and we survived it pretty well. But I will talk a little bit about space weather. You might have heard about piece of space debris that came down in Saskatchewan. I think the latest story I read was probably 7 pieces of space debris. That one almost the size of 4x8 feet of plywood, and it's weighed almost 100 pounds. And the farmer in Saskatchewan found that in the field in April, and they were going out to get ready to plant the crop. Briar Stewart, the CBC News out of London, UK, she just did a story a few weeks ago about all the GPS jamming and spoofing. And so jamming and spoofing is where you intentionally try to degrade the signals, and spoofing is where you actually put out fake signals and try to fool somebody into thinking there's someone where they're not. And so she did a presentation on that, and that slide is one that I used when I was in Calgary. It's a little bit dated, but if you go to GPS.org website. It's a daily plot of all the GPS jamming spoofing that's going on, and you can kind of see just in that what's going on in that part of the world. And I bet some other slides will show what it's like in Canada and the U.S., which is actually go pretty good. Get started now. I don't have to turn on. Right, quick flashback, 1978. We all remember where we worked, except maybe 1, 2 people in the back of the room there, but gasoline, 20 cents a liter, right? I think it was still in gallons, so I converted it. Maybe you were saving up your money from your summer job, to buy your first Ed 28 Camaro. Maybe you were taking a 4-can course in computers. Maybe with a stack of punch cards, and every line in your code was a punch card, and you used that stack of cards through your card reader, and don't drop them, because then you had to shuffle the deck, right? Maybe you're living in your parents' basement at the time. I'm not judging you, but maybe you had a great record player and fantastic albums from the day. From the comfort of your parents' basement, you could rotate the TV antenna, and point it to 1 or 2 TV stations you can get. Our idea of online shopping is to see how long can you get your mail and order something through the 1-800 number to the nearest town to where you live. And then, if you did run out of gas because you're kind of pushing to be easy on your car, you'd have to hitchhike to the nearest payphone and call your father or your friend or somebody to come bring you some gas. So kind of 1978. Is that me with the laser pointed? That's the, okay. Oh, okay. So, all right, 1978. Also the year that the first GPS satellite was launched. It would take 17 more years before the GPS constellation of 24 satellites was declared operational. So it took a little while to get to that point in 1995. 1978, on the 24th of January, kind of a good space debris story. Some of you remember this one. The Russians had a number of satellites, 33 to be exact. They were radar satellites. And radar systems, kind of like the microwave oven in the kitchen, takes a lot of power. And because they were operating it down just kind of skirting along with the Earth's atmosphere starts to pick up quite a bit, solar panels just wouldn't work because it caused too much drag. So what the Russians did is they put a nuclear reactor on board the satellite. And that worked great at producing power, and their idea was at the end of the life, they would put that satellite into a disposal orbit at an altitude of about 900 kilometers, where it would stay for many centuries. Except for Cosmos 954, their attempt to boost that satellite up to 900 kilometers, that didn't go according to plan, and instead the entire satellite, with the nuclear reactor, entered Canadian area, Northwest Territories, just south of Yellowknife from Great Slave Lake all the way up to Baker Lake, an area about 124,000 kilometers. And for me, that's a hard number to kind of grasp. The way I like to think of it is about 70% of the size of the state of Florida. You had to go and find this space debris that was radioactive. And it was quite a mess. This book, Operation Morning Light by Leo Heath, if you haven't read it, interesting read. You can get it through the local public library as soon as I return it. Ellen Power is a woman. She did a master's thesis through the University of Toronto. So if you go online, you can find different research papers that she did. And there's a podcast, 8-episode podcast. And so if you enjoy podcasts, you might like that one. It's by a Denver Journal in Northwest Territories. Lots of interviews and old archival radio footage, which I really found interesting. So that was Cosmos 954. Oh, well, I'm going to figure this out quickly. All right, 1978, also the year I joined the Canadian military. I went to school for about 4 years, then went to navigator school, so not a pilot, but a navigator. The guy that sits in the back, and he would say, we tell pilots where to go. But we direct all the tactical operations, and we tell the pilots where to go, because we're chasing a submarine. That's the whole idea. We'd spend about 6 to 9 months at sea a year. This, you can see right here, is the dipping sonar, and that's what we would come into a hover and lower that down in the water, and that's what we'd use to chase submarines around. Now and then, because we're out working in the middle of the Atlantic, because we're working off the back of the ship, often we get called upon to go do search and rescue too. Not quite clear from my bio, but I kind of made a break from naval aviation in 1997. I went back to school and after I did a master's degree down at Lake Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. And I did my thesis in jamming GPS. So so that's kind of how I got started into the GPS side, even though we had GPS on the sequence for the last couple of years that I was flying. And that kind of put me on a whole new course career-wise, where I went off and taught space and GPS stuff in Winnipeg for 5 years. In 2004, really great opportunity. A friend called me up and said, hey, there's an opening at the Sapphire Project. It's a project to get DND's first military satellite, an operational satellite that's going to have a telescope on it and look out into space and look at space debris, which I jumped at the chance to go do that. Did that for 3 years. The long bungee cord of naval aviation pulled me back for a couple of years. And then in 2009, kind of my dream job, I got to go and work as a GPS analyst at what's called the Joint Navigation Warfare Center, where we do really high-power type GPS jamming that would reach out and infect airplanes several hundred miles. So, jumping into space weather. You saw this, a friend of my daughter's, she works in Greenwood, so some of you may be in Greenwood, caught the northern lights in different parts of the province, this solar event that we had just recently. It turns out, about 15 months ago, we had a G3, G4 level storm, which I ended up doing some analysis on. So, similar kind of event, though, and maybe some of you already saw and read a little bit about the sun. It goes through this 11-year cycle, which we call solar max, and now and then it picks out solar flares and what are called CMEs, they're called coronal mass ejection. Whole whack of plasma that comes bombing to the Earth. Sometimes it can go that way or that way or that way, and then sometimes it comes towards us. When it comes towards us, that's when we run into problems. The Earth has got this great magnetic field going, so when these really highly charged particles come bombing along towards Earth, it's kind of like the days of Star Trek with shields up. You've got this great magnetic field that deflects most of these particles around the Earth and out the other side. But some of them find their way in at the poles, and that's what gives us beautiful northern lights, and also can mess up our satellite navigation and communication. Jumping into orbits. You can go online and you can find all sorts of great animations, but this is kind of how I do it. So a little bit old school. We're going to talk about 4 different types of orbits: LEO, MEO, GEO, and HEO, which are short for low Earth orbit, medium, geostationary orbit, and highly elliptical orbit. The Earth is about 6,378 kilometers in radius from the center out to the equator. The Earth's atmosphere is really close. When you ever see pictures of space shuttle flying around the Earth, you can kind of see that great blue glow around the Earth. But it's really quite close. So when it comes to putting satellites into orbit, we can get satellites in orbit about 250 kilometers. So they're very close. So when we talk about putting satellites in low Earth orbit, they're about 300 kilometers out to about 2,000 kilometers. When I talk about GPS satellites, they're out about 20,000 kilometers. So kind of about 3 of the radiuses of the Earth out. And the geostationary satellites, which are kind of unique, because they're at a distance where the time it takes to go around the Earth is at the very same amount of time it takes the Earth to do one rotation, which turns out to be about 4 minutes less than 24 hours. And any astronomers will be able to explain that to you and why that is. And so when it comes to geostationary, I'll go back to LEO then. So, whoops, that's not good. Sorry about that. Yeah, another solar event. So when we put a satellite into orbit, it can be in the plane of the equator, or you can tilt it up to a certain angle, tilt it from the equator, which we call the inclination. The space station is inclined at 51 degrees, 0.6. And we can have satellites that are in a polar orbit, and we actually tilt it over a little bit more, and we can have satellites in orbit at about 98 degrees, tilted from the plane of the equator. So the space station, you've heard about that. It's about 415 kilometers. We saw the astronauts / pilot. Whoops, let's do that. Who just arrived at the space station the other day? GPS satellites, and stuff I'm going to talk about a little bit more. Any of you have maybe had a satellite dish and you've had to point it out in space of your RV or at your cottage? Well, that's pointing out a geostationary satellite. It just happens that the Earth is rotating at the same rate that satellite is moving around. That's why that satellite appears to sort of hover like a helicopter, but it doesn't. It's smoking along around the Earth. It just happens to be synced up with the Earth. So the last type of orbit is our highly elliptical orbit. You can have an orbit that's circular, or you can have an orbit that's very elliptical shaped. What happens is the Earth is at the focal point of that ellipse. So any of your high school teachers, math teachers, that's where it is in a really elliptical orbit. And the Russians use that because what happens is a satellite speeds up and slows down in an elliptical orbit. It's falling towards the Earth. And so as it's falling towards Earth, it goes really fast at the perigee point, where it's close, and then it slows down when it gets way out there. So on a 12-hour orbit, it spends maybe 10 hours in the northern hemisphere over Russia. 12 hours later, Earth rotates, and that same satellite is over Canada. So those are the sort of 4 different types of orbit I was going to just quickly talk about. You might have heard of Elon Musk. Yep. SpaceX. Fantastic kind of stuff that he's done in terms of rocketry. The Falcon 9 rocket, it gets to 9 from the fact that it has 9 rocket engines. You can see one of them there. When you look up underneath it, you can see the 9 different nozzles for that Falcon 9 rocket. When I first started learning about rocketry, I really didn't appreciate the fact that a rocket like that, about 96% of it, is what it takes to get that last 3 or 4% of the payload into space. So Falcon 9 rocket weighs about 1.2 million pounds, and the payload is about 50,000 pounds. If you try to push that further out into space, it's even less kind of payload that you can put out there, or you need bigger rockets, kind of one or the other. The neat thing about SpaceX and the Falcon 9 is they reuse it. So it actually flies the object up into space. The first stage, you can see kind of where that black section is, that breaks away from the satellite and it comes back and lands, which means they can reuse it many times, which cuts the cost down. So everybody else in the launch industry is really in a bit of a challenge because the company has lowered the cost of putting objects into space by being able to reuse and reuse and reuse that same first stage, which has got all the rocket engines in. They can come back and land on land. They also can come back and land on a platform that's out in the ocean. So very kind of cool. Building on that expertise, they said, oh, we want to lift more stuff and put it out further, so we'll just take 3 of our Falcon 9 first stages, we'll bolt them together. So on the top left, you've got 3 times 9, so 27 rocket engines, and then a second stage on top of all of that. So it's not quite 3 Falcon 9s altogether, and so total, it can only get about 140,000 pounds out into low Earth orbit. If you're a company with a $500 million, $1 billion spy satellite or commercial type satellite, you really don't want to be the first guy putting your satellite into space on that rocket, right? So you say, it's like buying a new car when it first comes out the new model. Maybe I'll wait for the next year. Maybe, people who have $1 billion satellites are a bit more risk averse, maybe. And so Elon Musk said, okay, well, fair enough. Even though I was offering some really great deals on this first one, I'm just going to maybe a little bit of marketing. So I'm going to put my Tesla into the rocket, and I'm going to put it out into orbit, and it's now going around the sun, and it'll be back in about 23 years. So, on my bucket list, I'm going to live another 23 years to see this baby go by the Earth. Whoops, I'm sorry. Now, it's not just that they build rockets, but he said, I'm going to put internet into space. And this blew me away when one of my golf buddies said, you heard about Elon Musk and his satellite? Yeah. I said, I like these little CubeSats. They're pretty big. And I said, okay. And I discovered that they started out at about 300 kilograms. The latest ones are over 700 kilograms. But they designed them so you could stack them all up, and not just stack of around 50 satellites that they throw it into orbit. Any of you have kind of concerned about space debris said, hey, great idea. Their concept was, we're going to launch it into this really nice low orbit. We'll check it out, and if the satellite has a problem, we'll just let it re-enter Earth's atmosphere and burn up. No problem. Except, back to our space weather, at the very end of January in 2022, we had a couple of solar storms that were G1, G2. Nobody even cares about G1, G2, right? Except it was kind of back-to-back, one day after the other. And you might have seen that, it takes 3 or 4 days for the effects of the solar wind to get to Earth and create these northern lights. Well, they launched their stack of satellites on February 3rd, about the same time that bang, go. And what happens is when you get these solar events, geomagnetic storms, it heats up the Earth's atmosphere. And that heating of the Earth's atmosphere causes the density to get a little bit higher. So as they kicked all their satellites out, tried to get control of them, satellites are tumbling, they couldn't recover them, they couldn't get a hold of them. So 38 or the 49 satellites in that stock of satellites all re-entered Earth's atmosphere and burned up. That was space weather. The good news is that space weather cleans up space debris. It's just sometimes it's not quite what you want when you want. Space surveillance then. So this is when I worked on the Sapphire satellite. That's the satellite in the top left corner. We track space debris from this side, about 10 centimeters. The CubeSat that Eric talked about, if any of saw his presentation a year ago. You can kind of put these together. This is my $20 version of a $250,000 satellite. So you kind of get what you pay for, right? But ideally, it would point towards the Earth after we take off the remove before flight. But then you have to have all the electronics in that to make it kind of work. So it turns out, Dalhousie, Eric, you saw Eric's presentation last year? Okay, that's you. Okay, I won't go too long into that. But so you can track space debris about that size and bigger. So today there's almost 29,000 objects this size or bigger being tracked by this space surveillance network. The number of objects between this size and 1 centimeter is approaching 1 million. And the number of objects that are smaller than 1 centimeter is over 120 million. So things like specks of paint, ball bearings, those kind of things. So there's a lot of stuff out there, and what's tracked is only stuff like up to about 29,000. Having said that, the good news is, if you look at the history of space debris, the number of objects tracked has almost been double that. So if you look at the latest object that's identified and put into orbit, like one of those Starlink satellites, it'll have a NORAD ID number that is approaching 60,000. Because almost half of all the space debris that we've had, that size or bigger, has re-entered Earth's atmosphere, and much of it is just burned up. So, good news about space solar events and having space weather cause our satellites to degrade. Overall space surveillance network, made up of ground sensors and some space-based sensors, and Sapphire is one of those space-based sensors. Just to give you an idea, some of you, maybe you've got a sailboat or you've seen some of the little radars. On the back of the Sea King, it's a little black dome on the back behind the gearbox. This is called haystack radar. It's one of the it's one of the ground radars that's used in tracking objects. It went through an upgrade a little over a decade ago. It can track objects down to the millimeter level. Those objects are not put into the satellite catalog. We only look at stuff above 10 centimeters. So what they can do is look at clouds of debris. A really good example is, I mentioned Cosmospot 954. Good news is, almost all those satellites are up at 900 kilometer altitude. Bad news is when they kicked out those reactor cores have liquid metal coolant made of sodium and potassium, and there's about 128 kilograms of liquid metal that's now frozen into these nice microgravity type spheres that are like ball bearings, golf balls, and baseballs, smoking around about 50,000 of them up around 900 kilometers in altitude. So good news, bad news when it comes to Cosmos 954. The radar systems are really good at detecting satellites and debris that are down in the low Earth environment, because the radar signal's got to go out and bounce back. So that's why telescopes become very important for looking at things that are further out in space. One of the unclassified photos, it just shows you when they did the upgrade on the radar a decade ago, how that imaging capability of the radar can look at a satellite, and that's about a 2-foot size satellite. I mentioned I worked in New Mexico at Kirtland Air Force Base. It's a base of over 20,000 people. All sorts of different things are going on there. And because I worked in space surveillance before I went there, I never actually got the chance to enter this facility, but I drove by it many times. And there's also good pictures online that you can find it. The telescope on the top right, you can see a person standing right here on the corner. Give you a sense of the size of the telescope. The dome on the left, it's nice and shiny and silver. What it does is it goes up and down the wall bed, which then exposes the satellite, exposes the telescope into the space environment, and it's got a little lid that opens and closes on it. And one of the unclassified photos from this one, called Starfire, was of the Columbia about 2 minutes before it finally disintegrated over the eastern part of Texas. And on that photo, you can see the left wing is just starting to disintegrate, apparently. For our astronomers, a few of them, you may have heard of sodium guide stars. So on this telescope, they have a laser that points out into space. And this laser, it just happens to be a sodium wavelength light, and at about an altitude of 90 kilometers, there's a bunch of sodium atoms bombing around. And when you blast those with this sodium laser, it creates this fake star. Except it gets distorted because of the Earth's atmosphere. So you can feed that information back into the telescope, which has all these actuators on the back of the telescope, which is like kind of changing your glasses many times per second. And that's what the telescope does using the sodium guide star and adaptive optics, which is another whole field of study. This telescope in the top left, top right, that's one I did have a chance to see when I was working on Sapphire. Biggest one that I know of in the U.S. inventory. And you can see the people right here in behind the telescope. Wide angle photo, so maybe it distorted a little bit. And on the left, you can see a similar type dome to the one that's in Albuquerque. And you can see an image of the International Space Station taken to the telescope. And on the bottom left, that is a telescope that used to be at White Sands Missile Range, about a 2-hour drive from Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was there while I was there doing GPS stuff up on a mountain range. But the Australians and the U.S. signed an agreement back in 2013. They disassembled that telescope, moved it to Australia, and now it's owned by the U.S. but operated by the Aussies. And it collects space debris and space object data. The term we use in space surveillance is actually resident space objects, or RSO. So if I use the word RSO, I'm talking about anything, satellites, old satellites that don't work, and space debris. This slide, a little bit dated, but it points out a couple of things that are important. In 2019, where this slide kind of goes through, we were just kind of over 19,000 objects. So in 5 years, we went from 19,000 to almost 29,000 objects in space. Part of that is because Elon Musk has got 6,000 satellites added to the mix. In 2007, the Chinese fired a missile up to intercept one of their weather satellites. And if you read the news, you say, oh, China shot their satellite down. But technically, you don't really shoot a satellite down when it's at 850 kilometers. What you do is you cause it to explode. And because orbital periods depend on the velocity, when this thing explodes, it goes up, it goes down, it goes sideways, and now you have a whole cloud of debris at different speeds that suddenly becomes a huge donut shape of debris all around the Earth, which really mucks up that whole orbit. About 2 years later, there was an unintentional collision between two satellites. The Russian satellite was just kind of flying along, minding its own business, and Iridium satellite owned by the U.S. They sent some command to it to do a maneuver, and then it didn't answer back shortly afterwards. And then the Space Surveillance Network said, hey, we got a couple of clouds of debris going this way and that way. So bad news. That contributed again. So just looking at that pink line, 2 events almost doubled the amount of fragmentation debris. Fragmentation debris. When we put things into space, sometimes the rocket bodies get left in space. Sometimes you got old satellites that don't work. So you can have batteries on the satellites that cause it to explode, or the batteries explode and they cause the satellite to explode. Leftover fuel in a tank or some kind of uneven heating, it can cause that old rocket body to explode. So when we talk about space debris, a lot of it is part of that cause of fragmentation happening in orbit. Now, as Elon Musk kind of learned in February 2022, our space weather can actually improve and get rid of space debris. And if you kind of look at that plot, you wouldn't necessarily notice it right away, but every kind of 11-year solar cycle, we get a nice kind of cleaning up. So it's not like we're on this continuous slope upwards, because every 11 years kind of, with plus or minus a few years, we get a reduction too, kind of happening at the same time. And I think I found this slide, which came out in a NASA report at the end of December on fragmentation debris. And don't worry about any of the numbers on it. The main thing there is that with the last 5 solar cycles we went through, if you were to look at the years on the bottom, you'd see they kind of line up with an 11-year cycle. And so in yellow, that's the solar activity going on. And in red, you can see little bumps, which are fragmentation events. You can see in the top right, the big one in 2007, 2009, and also the Russians did an anti-satellite test in 2021, I think, yeah, which bumped it up. Made people on the space station not very impressed because that one was at about 480 kilometers. The space station is around 400 kilometers. So we know that debris is going to find its way down, and so it was kind of astronauts to, shelter stations for a certain period of time. So that gives you an idea of how the good side of space weather is at cleaning up space debris. The reference I use is celesttrack.org. The guy by the name of Colonel Tom Kelso, who retired from the U.S. Air Force, from the USAF. Amazing guy if you just read his bio, but if you go to celesttrack.org and you scroll down, you can go to what's called a satellite catalog box store. And you can look up and say, oh, Canada's got this many satellites, and this many satellites that are still working and not working, and this many pieces of space debris by country. Really kind of neat. That number is almost 29,000 now, and over 10,000 satellites are still in space and working. Of those 10,000 satellites, over 6,000 belong to Elon Musk. So over 60% of all the satellites in space belong to SpaceX. Blows me away, because I did this stuff 20 years ago, right? Jamie Matthews, he's a professor at the University of British Columbia. The MOST satellite was not designed for space surveillance, but you can see it's got a 6-inch telescope there. It had to turn 90 degrees so it would fit into the launch vehicle to put it into space. But that was in 2003, and I arrived at Sapphire in 2004. So we were really interested in knowing what can you do with a telescope that size and a spacecraft that size. What MOST did is it looked out at a star, one star, for 60 days, nonstop, looking for the smallest, tiniest, minute variation in the brightness of that star. And astronomers and people that study that kind of stuff, that's a whole field on its own. What we wanted to know was, hey, can you use your satellite just briefly to look at a GPS satellite? Then we would know that the theory of being able to use a telescope of that size, we could use it for tracking space debris. So we went and met Jamie and said, hey, a research scientist we have by the name of Lockie Scott out of Ottawa, fantastic research scientist. He figured it all out because the camera and the field of view is very small on MOST, and he had to time it so that we could look at the perfect time. Because what we're looking at when we look at space debris and fixed objects, it's the light reflecting off the object that allows us to see that. So you have to time. It's kind of like the full moon. If you think about the full moon, you got to time it with your satellite in space to kind of look out and see when the sun is shining on an object out in space. So it's kind of like you put your Sapphire satellite, your telescope, to your back, and you look out that way. Or if you had a ground-based telescope and you're looking out, then the same kind of thing, you would look out at nighttime to do that. The telescope in the bottom center is called, it was part of our concept demonstration system for the Sapphire satellite. Because what we were trying to do is get Canadian military folks back into the groove about how do we track space debris. And so we have 3 of those telescopes spread across Canada, and we use that telescope to look at a GPS satellite. The nice thing about GPS satellites is we know where they are really precisely. So we can time our telescope to look at that spot at a very precise time. And sure enough, with a 14-inch Celestron telescope, we can look at a detected GPS satellite. And for the astronomers, they'll tell you, you can take the telescope and rotate it at the same rate the Earth is rotating so that the stars appear to be stationary. So now anything that's moving in that field of view that's not a star is going to be that little streak of our GPS satellite. The important thing then is timing the beginning and ending of that streak. Sapphire was a satellite I worked on, and in the same kind of parallel time was a satellite called NEOSat. It was a research and development satellite, and the reason I mentioned MOST is what we did is we took some of the leftover parts from the MOST satellite program and created a new and improved version of that to do asteroid detection, and this was our D&D research satellite to do space debris research. Designed with a 1-year design life, still going. In 2016, when it was only 3 years old, we had a problem with it though. When satellites have onboard systems for figuring out, where are the stars, because you have to be able to orient this satellite to point down at the Earth. And part of that attitude control system had a problem. And when a satellite is designed to last 1 year, you kind of pack up your laptop and say, hey, we got 3 years of this guy's pretty good. But research scientists, again, Lockie and some contractors put their heads together and they figured out how they could use the GPS on the satellite, well, even though it wasn't designed to do that, to figure out the attitude of the spacecraft and use that as a core sensor to feed that into the attitude control system. And voila, they were able to recover the satellite, stop it from tumbling, and that satellite now is still growing. And hopefully it lasts kind of like most, it just goes on and on and on. This is Sapphire. This is a satellite I worked on. Very similar in Neosat, except this one is designed as a 5-year life. And anytime you make a satellite and you try to design it to last longer, it generally gets bigger and heavier, and you got more redundancy because you got more spare systems all integrated together on your satellite. These kind of guys, generally not a lot of redundancy and designed to last about 6 months. Sapphire designed to last 5 years and still going like Neosat. And hopefully it will last a lot longer than Neosat. But it also has GPS system on board. The important thing about GPS is it gives us very precise time. You need very precise time because we're trying to, when you're traveling at 70 plus kilometers a second, and you're trying to take an image of something that's traveling 5, 6, 7 kilometers a second, it's important that you know what time it is when you snap the shutter. Because all the accuracy of figuring out where that piece of object is in space relies, in big part on how accurate you can point and how precise you can mark that image. You might have saw this in the news about 3 years ago, the International Space Station, the Canadarm. We've seen it, with astronauts on the end. We've seen it with satellites on the end. I'm not sure many of you have seen it with it taking out the trash. And this was 5,800 pounds of old used batteries. It was supposed to come back on a cargo ship back to Earth, but things didn't work out, so they just said, okay, we're just going to throw that out into space. 5,800 pounds of space debris. It took about 3 years for that to come back to Earth, and in theory, it was burned up in the atmosphere. In practice, this little cylindrical object found its way through a guy's roof in Florida on the same day. You might have heard that story where it went, second floor, first floor, and thankfully didn't hit anybody. And NASA confirmed that it did come from the structure of holding that pallet together. Right, so I got a riddle for you. School teachers? Sailors, maybe? All right. Here's the question. We've got a pilot, he's flying along, he's got some engine trouble, he has to do a crash landing. So she lands at that spot marked back. She gets out of her plane, she walks 10 miles south, she walks 10 miles to the east, and she walks 10 miles to the north. And she finds herself back at the crash site. 10 miles south, 10 miles east, 10 miles south. Back at the crash site. Yeah, North Pole. Now the second question is, so I will show you a diagram about that a little bit later. The second question is, can there be more than 10, 20 locations on the surface of the Earth where you can go 10 miles south, 10 miles east, 10 miles north? Well, if you're at the South Pole, you can't walk south, right? Yeah, but the question is, can you walk south? Can you walk south, and then east, and then north? Walk back there, because you're pretty close on south. So this is my transition to GPS. How are we doing time, Martin? I'll be back. Imagine if we didn't have GPS this morning when we woke up. Now you might go, hey, we had a solar storm months ago. No big surprise. We lost GPS. We lost SATCOM. No, but pretend we didn't have that solar storm. And imagine if you didn't have GPS, how would it have impacted you? And GPS is short for Global Positioning System. And most people go, well, I lose GPS, I lose positioning. And you go, that's going to be kind of like a 9/11 day. It's going to mess up pilots because they're so used to flying at time. It's going to kind of mess them up because they're so reliant on having the GPS signal. There's a thing called precision GPS, which uses the actual wavelength of the GPS to get us down into centimeter and millimeter type accuracy. That's not what we have with our cell phones today. But any kind of sector that uses that, like surveyors, the mining, the farmers, you would have heard all those sort of folks had problems when we had the solar storm. What most people don't kind of realize is there are a bunch of GPS receivers that are designed for time synchronization. Our power grid relies on GPS. Our cell phones that we use, yeah, you've got a GPS in your cell phone, but the network requires the time synchronization. And as we go to 5G and better, we're trying to cram more and more stuff in. It means our networks have to be synchronized very precisely. So the GPS receivers are designed for time synchronization. And so if you jam GPS, you can cause a whole world of hurt when it comes to the national infrastructure. That's why any system that uses GPS for time synchronization has got a good backup system. And you say, okay, well, that's, kind of never going to happen. I mentioned I worked in New Mexico, and we did these high-powered jamming trials. And this is one from 2019. This was after I retired. But this was the U.S. Navy ran one off the coast of Georgia. High-power type stuff reaches out to over 1,000 kilometers. So airplanes that are flying around in Ohio and Pennsylvania could potentially lose their GPS signals from this kind of jamming. So the military doesn't just go do this kind of randomly. They do it with a well-organized plan with the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration. And they put out what's called a no-jam. So they tell all the pilots, hey, your GPS is probably not going to work, but even worse, it might give you some misleading information, which is really going to mess you up. So you've got to be really careful because GPS is not going to work when we're doing these trials. I mentioned the GPS constellation, 24 satellites, and the whole idea behind the GPS constellation was at any one time you wanted to be able to see at least 6 satellites in view, because you need to figure out your kind of X, Y, and Z. But because the clock in your phone or your GPS receiver, a good old Garmin 12XL here, over 25 years old now, with a constellation of 24 satellites, you could see about 12 satellites. And so a lot of the GPS receivers in those early days were 12-channel GPS receivers like my 12XL. Today there's 31 satellites, and so way better kinds of accuracy, and then I'm going to talk more about GPS signals themselves. So GPS doesn't have a monopoly on satellite navigation, you might have heard, but the Russians have their own system, the Chinese have their own system, and the Europeans have their own system. Anybody who's designing a GPS receiver now, like your iPhone, can use all those satellite navigation signals. And so can use, unlike my good old 12XL, now you have access to over 100 satellites to use to figure out your position. So on top of that, you already have a cell phone that has a pretty good idea where it's starting out from. So all those kind of satellites provide some amazing accuracy now when it comes to position. I started out in my early days back in 95, 96, 97 when I was flying out a HOTES with a test flight squadron. And we were testing these systems there in anticipation of a new airplane. Then my 12XL, and these are a variety of different ones I've brought in my different buckets. If any of you played around with some of these different GPS receivers. So maybe you've seen something like this, it just plugs into your USB port, it goes on to the roof of your car. Something as simple as that, just a USB stick as a complete GPS receiver. And maybe you've suddenly got an Apple Watch. When it comes to the GPS and you talk about space systems, often you talk about the user segment. That's us with the GPS receiver. You've got the control segment. And the GPS satellites, to put it in perspective a bit, they weigh about the same as my RAV4. The GPS satellites have an onboard propulsion system, and they have enough onboard propulsion in their on the GPS satellite. They have enough propulsion, which is equivalent to the total weight of the Sapphire satellite. And so the satellites in the GPS orbit can be repositioned to optimize the accuracy of the overall constellation. And so the folks that control those are from Schriever Space Force Base, originally called the Air Force Base Center. One problem that's been in the news a little bit is whenever you have these ground control systems, you need to also have improvements to that in sync with your satellites. So they've got these new satellites called the Block 3 variants, except they've got more capability than the ground system can kind of handle. So the ground system is going to do a little bit of catching up to get kind of back in sync. GPS satellites look something like that. I always kind of go top-bottom, but what I would call the top of those figures are the array of antennas which form this beam, which is a wee bit wider than the diameter of the Earth from 20,000 kilometers looking down. So create this phased array antenna, which kind of is designed to shape roughly the curvature of the Earth. So in theory, you kind of get a similar type signal depending wherever you are in that beam. Sometimes some of these questions come up, how much do they cost? I call it kind of about a third of $1 billion for one satellite. Costs about $67 million because you get in the bargain because you're using the Falcon 9. The latest Block 3 is about 5,000 pounds. I did my presentation at Calgary a little while, so I had to put work trucks into it. Right? Nobody from the West here? Okay. Now, when we talk about signal levels, I know most people don't understand, or maybe understand when I say minus 130 dB milliwatts. And I promised Vern I wouldn't be too technical. I had an instructor one time say, what do you mean? Okay, well, it's like a 40-watt light bulb at the North Pole, and you flatten the Earth out, and you try to see that light bulb from the South Pole. Because the distance from pole to pole is about 20,000 kilometers, plus or minus. I have to do the math again, but so it's a really, really weak signal. It's so weak, it's down in what we call the noise floor electronics. And your receiver does this magic of pulling that signal back out and then being able to measure the range to it. This is the latest batch of satellites made by Lockheed Martin. I grabbed these off their website. You can see the two technicians kind of working along the bottom of the satellite. 6 out of 10 of these satellites have been launched, and 4 are just waiting to be launched. I don't know the whole reason behind it, but it might have something to do with the fact that they're still waiting for that ground control segment to get figured out. And some of it is the old satellites are still working too, so you don't necessarily need to launch these guys just yet. That's a picture with the solar panel. And again, you can see the text working on the bottom left corner. And because I had a bit of a radar background, I love this slide. It's called an anechoic chamber. It's like, remember Get Smart, Don Adams, in the cone of silence? Some of you might remember that. Okay. This is kind of like a huge cone of silence. And the idea is any radio signals don't get into the facility, and so you can test any kind of electric signals, electronics, to make sure once it's on the satellite doesn't interfere with other signals on the satellite. I mentioned, about 3 or 4% of the total rocket is just the payload or the astronauts or whatever that you're throwing up in orbit. And that gives you a sense of just the magnitude of the satellite in the nose bearing, and that just kind of comes apart once it gets up into space. And those are 2 different launch vehicles, and there's another launch vehicle coming online soon to kind of compete with Falcon 9 to scale that down. And that's the Falcon 9 launching the first Block 3 satellite. So GPS satellites, out about 20,000 kilometers in altitude, and they're tilted from the Earth's equator at 55 degrees. So I'm going to turn my back here just so I get my angles right here. So the plane of the equator, and we tilt it up 55 degrees. Now, it's 20,000 kilometers out, so it's about a little over 3 times the radius of the Earth out. And there's 6 planes. So there's a plane here, and then if I were to rotate the Earth around 60 degrees, there's another orbital plane. And each of those orbital planes had 4 satellites each. And that's how we got the GPS constellation originally, with 24 satellites in that orbit. And the whole idea was we wanted to be able to feed at least 4 satellites. That designed around seeing 6 satellites, so we could use 4 of those satellites to figure out where we are. I threw this plot in. This is a 2D plot. Sometimes I find different things help with different folks, depending on how you visualize. This is if you were to take a pencil that was 20,184 kilometers long and stick it through the satellite and drag it across the surface of the Earth over the course of the day. You would get 2 of these shapes. The neat thing is, because it's tilted, the GPS satellites are in an inclined orbit at 55 degrees, the highest point that ground trace ever goes is plus or minus 55 degrees in latitude. The satellite beam that it transmits is, the size of the diameter of the Earth. It's much bigger than that, but this is just where the satellite is over the Earth at any one instant in time. Any of you might have used a handheld GPS like my guy here, maybe on your cell phone. You would have seen this plot. It's called a sky plot. You're standing in the top left. You're sitting at the crosshairs, and that's for looking up directly overhead. Anything that's low on the horizon is satellites that are low on the horizon. One thing I found in my years of teaching was people didn't really grasp how far away the satellites are. Well, when I talk about how weak the signals are, how easy it is to read and track your GPS signals. So what I did is I use that same plot, but now what I did is I put a user at the Halifax airport, and then over the window of 24 hours, it said, tell me in bright yellow, when do I have a GPS satellite in view? So now when I look at that sky plot, and I say, I got a satellite that's low on the horizon out to the west, that satellite's way out over the Pacific. If I've got a GPS satellite that's really low on the horizon to the south, where the south is here, it's over South America. Or southeast, over Northwest Africa, and to the east, over Europe. That's how far away those satellites are. So it doesn't take very much to lose those signals when you take your GPS receiver or your phone, and you kind of go like this. So you go to the north side of the building, you go to the south side of the building, all kinds of different things that you can show folks to show how easy it is to lose your signal. And you might have seen that if you've got an older phone, and when you go indoors, your signals are not as strong. Because it's got this challenge of how far away it is and coming in. Basic then, it's kind of like 4 beach balls and where they intersect. I'm going to measure my distance from 4 different satellites and where they intersect. In theory, I could just use 3. Problem is my clock is not very accurate. So the old high school math, I used 4 equations, 4 unknowns to solve for that error in the clock as well. This slide I always take out, and I always put it back in, even though it's 24 years old now, because the U.S. used to intentionally degrade GPS signals. And when they did that, when they first started out back in 1978, and then they were working towards 1995, they went, wow, this is really good. We don't want to give our enemy or any civilians this kind of capability. So they did a thing called selective availability, and they degraded the signal for some years. And eventually, they stopped doing that on the 2nd of May in 2000. The same day I was giving a GPS presentation in Ontario. And I heard it on the news. So, nobody really wanted to hear a presentation. They just wanted to know what's going on here or there. Because we went from this kind of GPS receiver being, within 40 or 50 meters. That's not bad. I mean, considering if you're used to using a map and compass, so suddenly now we had an accuracy of a few meters overnight. That changed everything. What I meant was industry were already ramped up, kind of anticipating it. Any geocachers? If people would go out, this is a hobby, and look for stuff. It can be this little yellow container, a little notepad in it, and this is all the geocache sites in this western part of Nova Scotia, every little green dot. If you go to Kedzie, that's where that particular one was, and that's my backpack. I was looking for that, and you found it, and took a picture of it. So that's called geocaching and looking for objects. Now, it turns out a Canadian sailor established the first geocache site up by Exit 7 on the 103. If you go to Graves Island, you will see this monument. The better word is that. Hunk of rock, a marker, thank you. It shows the latitude and longitude of that first geocache site. If you put that geocache site in and you're standing at Graves Island, and you're the visitor center, and you go, that's not what I'm. It's because the site is up at Exit 7. Okay? And that's one of my trusted border collies out for a hike that day. All right, so we figured that out, right? South, east, north. We forget that our lines of longitude converge at the poles. So you can walk 10 miles south, you can walk 10 miles, 20 miles, a million miles, as you just keep going around in circles, and eventually you can walk back to the north. The second part I'm going to talk about is for the break. So that's where we're going to take about a 15-minute break. How are we doing time-wise? Not too bad. Not too bad. So call it 15 minutes, a bit longer maybe if you need it, and we'll come back. I'm going to talk about GPS jammers. So little guys like this that truckers buy so that you can't know what you're doing with the company truck after hours. They're advertised to have a range of about 5 meters, and they reach out about a kilometer. So truckers often don't know how bad these things are. Right. So when we come back after the break, I'm going to talk about small stuff like this, things like the space weather, how it can mess up GPS, and more powerful type jamming stuff. For many years. All right, so I said you might have to put your thinking caps on for this one. I promised for it I wouldn't be too technical. And someone said South Pole, and I said, I saw them down in Plains. But, because if you take our handy-dandy globe, here are the lines of long-distance converge at the poles, and what we need to do is get to a spot where that distance in a circle is 10 miles. Because we go 10 miles north of that, then we walk 10 miles south, then we walk east in a circle, and we're back to the spot where we walk 10 miles north, and we're back. Now, any of you who are math users, I made that circle. Go around it. Right? So this is one of those calculus type questions, right? Remember those days? All right. So there's a lot more than just a few spots on the Earth where you can go 10 miles northeast. To the point where our person was 10. Good, 10. That's an easy name to remember. You go to the South Pole and you go, and then you start walking circles. You get 10 miles, right? So then you have to go 10 miles north of that. Right, so you go 10 miles north of, about the South Pole. You go around and around for 10 miles, and you go back there. So anywhere between 11.6 and about 10. Anywhere in between that, you can do that. I went through my training age, and I forgot to mention this guy. When we put things into orbit, you got to go pretty fast. Speed of bullets, my Superman days, about a kilometer per second, plus or minus a bit. If I want to put that, and if I fire that up in the air, there's some statistics about how many people die from shooting into the air. Okay. But if I want to put that in orbit, I would have to get this bullet going from 1 kilometer a second to about 8 kilometers a second. That's why I need huge rockets to accelerate that baby up and then get it going parallel to the surface of the Earth. That kind of speed. So I just forgot my hand again. The solar storm that we had there a month ago, that plasma that's coming bombing along towards the Earth. So we got a bullet at 1 kilometer a second. We got a satellite at 8 kilometers a second and forward to get into space. That plasma is coming at us at about 706 kilometers a second. It is packing a ton. That's why it's so energetic, and that's why it causes so much problems in thinking as far as magnetic field around the Earth. So 1 kilometer, 8 kilometers, and 750 kilometers a second. I like the 8 kilometers a second because I can go from Chester Basin to Chester, which I think as a first flight is about 6 kilometers. So in less than a second, I can go from there to there. Give you a sense of how fast satellites can travel. And why, when people space debris as small as a speck of paint used to hit the wind field of the space shuttle, they had to, in the first decade of flying the space shuttle, they had to change the wind field something like 45 times. Because a little speck of paint would be like a big gravel stone hitting your carbon. And it would damage those windows. Eventually, they turned the trouble around. Do that. All right, so that's my little training I just forgot. On this one, I'm going to be too technical. GPS signals are spread spectrum signals. And so they're spread over a wide bandwidth. And when we started out, the signals that the military used was the two dark brown ones, and then had this other signal that was called the yellow one, of course, after this. The military receivers had to use that green one on the top left as a stepping stone to get to the military signals which were encrypted. That's what we had for many years. Then the civilians went, hey, we want our own civilian signals. And the reason for that is because if you have GPS signals on 2 different frequencies, you can measure the ionosphere delay. If just one frequency, you have to have a model. With our little handheld GPS or our phones, up until today pretty much, they're single frequency phones, or iPhones. That allows you to strip off ionosphere again. And so if you look at this kind of what I call the hockey shot full of air kind of from top to bottom. And we had selective availability, that was the biggie. We got rid of that, and that's when the Australia said, hey, okay, let's give it the second frequency so we can get rid of that ionic signal, right? Get ourselves down to a really active position. So if you look, if you've got your latest and greatest iPhone product or ultra watch, with the GPS L1, L5 capable device, which means it can skip off that air. It means we're going to accuracy today of about 3 or 4 meters, and we need GPS to power your phone. It's better than any. And the surveyors, they use a different technique to get down the menu. But that's your average kind of phone. Over the next few years, as we get new phones, dual frequency phones, we're going to see that improvement in position. Back in the early days, I call it the geek club and the nerd club, and no disrespect to those technical. Really an idea, and they said, I'm at a survey location, and I get my GPS and it says I'm over here by 10 or 20 or 50 meters, so I know what my air is. Now if I just broadcast that air over a radio wave, concept of differential GPS. It's a way of transmitting those errors to a user nearby. And if you ever see the surveyors, all sorts of different people that use differential GPS, a really wide spectrum of people that use that in different ways. And this came about mainly because of selective availability. That's why I kept my selective availability slide in there, because this kind of helps explain how we went down this road of I need to get rid of that selective availability, which was an intentional error. But if I know where I am, I can send that correction to anybody nearby with the errors. And that was the whole idea behind differential GPS. Gone north, Highway 12, out of Conservation, Forest Heights School. You're in the parking lot there. There's this metal bar. Looks like kind of a square-shaped rod that goes up to the top of the roof. There's this silver disc above it. It's a GPS receiver by Natural Resources Canada that's further reviewed. Which is a differential type system. Okay. You can get a user ID and log into it. It's just generally kind of boring looking at something that's one position. For me, it's really interesting when we talk about two gas station loss of GPS signals not coming to the Halifax airport. So the FAA, back in the day, said, hey, differential GPS ID, it's kind of a cool idea. What if we put that on the scale of the whole of the United States? We had a bunch of stations. We measure those errors in the ionosphere, but now what we'll do is we'll send those to a geostationary satellite. That geostationary satellite will transmit those signals down to an airplane. So now the airplane got a really nice, free GPS signal. That's a wide area augmentation for WAP. And even your little latest devices can make use of that differential space-based stretch. So you can have local differential and space-based differential stretch. The downside to this, as you can see from Halifax, these satellites are pretty low on the horizon. It turns out they're quite vulnerable to interference. This is one of my oldest GPS receivers, and when you look at, you can see that little letter D, that tells you you're getting a differential section on your little hand. You've got the Y. So I'm doing something to GPS jamming and interference. And we saw that solar storm that we had about a month ago. And it turns out you can also have electronics that are just pulling in. And they can be passive electronics, not even meant to transmit, but they accidentally transmit interference signals in the GPS section. And when the GPS signals are so weak that are arriving at your system, it's so easy for some unintentional piece of radio signals to interfere with the system. The solar storm that we had just recently, a really nice one. And then on the top right, this is the kind of jammer I mentioned that truckers use. Now, in Canada, $5,000 fine if you own one, $25,000 fine if you're a company, and up to 1 year in jail if somebody convicted for just buying, selling, importing, exporting, possessing before you can plug it into your cigarette lighter in your car. Right? So Imagery Canada takes it pretty seriously, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And that's a jamming system down in White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, about 2 hour drive from where I live before you. That's really fun. So back in 2001, this was a differential base station down near Monterey. Everybody's out there in their boats traveling around, and they say, hey, yes, it's not working. So, like most people, we go, obviously, go buy a new one. And get the new one, and it's still not working. And so there's a bigger problem. And they were causing all this. And eventually they go, we call it sniffer, it's a directional antenna, a little spectrum analyzer, and try to track down where these interference signals coming from. And they're like, okay. And it turned out there was more than one. And all it was this, back in the day, we would have an antenna for getting our TV, or VHF, antenna. It's down at this frequency range. It's just that it was poorly made, and it wasn't even a transmitter. It's just receiving signals, but except it's an amplifier in it, meant to amplify the signal so you could get your TV. Except at that frequency, the harmonic, and because it's poorly designed, it's kind of drifting in and out, and now and then you're drifting your GPS back and forth, looking forward, and of course the temperature would change, the signal and the jamming system would go, jamming signal, would go away. It took them a while to figure it out, and then there was more than one, so they got one, and then there was still more things. So that was part of the problem on the proxy side. Eventually they solved that problem. And this is the other one I'm going to talk about. About a year and a bit ago, two Dash 8 airplanes coming into land at Halifax Airport, and they both lost their GPS signal almost at the very same time. And I thought, woohoo! I'm going to go catch a trucker. Right? I'm in business. I've finally got a real job, right? And then, but then I go, you only got a range of a kilometer. And then I looked at where the two airplanes were. One was up north to Halifax Airport, and the other one was right over the Bay of Fundy. I'm like, that's the kind of gem that we use in New Mexico, right? If that was the kind of gem that was going on, there would have been a lot of other people complaining about it. So it was like, a very short scratch of the head and go, I didn't think when that happened. A few weeks ago, and I think I'm looking at this, there's some great northern lights. So you can always, if you're a GPS person, go, Great Northern Lights, great GPS interference. Right? So as it turns out, I did my kind of first look. That's not a GPS camera. It's not some problem with the airplane tilting. Because two airplanes probably not going to tilt at the same time and lose that signal. And yes, okay. And then sure enough, on the 20th of March, 3 days before, we had a G3, G4 level geomagnetic storm. It started out at that level. It's got satellites that are out there in space that detect solar events. That's kind of what we're expecting. But on the 23rd of March, they bumped that up to a G3, G4 level, which says GPS is getting up. And so it turns out our differential correction coming from our Y satellite is low in the horizon, which our pilot needs. Satellites are really low in the horizon because of GPS interference. And the nice thing was this happened right near the end of March, and the FAA puts out a quarterly report. So at the same time I'm going through and looking at all the data and convincing myself it was a problem, I found out that the airplanes overwrite their data every day. So I couldn't get the airplanes to actually confirm my theory. But there's enough other input that you can get from Natural Resources Canada. And if you're really interested in that stuff, you can go to my website, and there's a complete paper of about 30 slides. It's got a lot more technical detail. Obviously, it isn't technical. But you can go and find a very technical type paper to talk about this stuff. So GPS jammers. Now we're talking about intentional jammers. Truckers, you can buy these if you go to jammerstore.com, jammer-store.com. You can buy these online. They started about $120 and go up to at least $1,000 US. Some phenomenal type jammer. And honestly, I've been at the range in Petawawa, which is northwestern Ottawa. And the DMV and the RCMP are allowed to go by these and test them. But what you'll notice, and I'll show you on another slide, is because this puts out so much power and because that DJ6, I can run a jam right on that one. I don't want to jam. Great device. Jams well over 5 kilometers. Problem is, the advertisements have a very short range. Even the truckers don't realize how bad they are. And I mentioned how serious it is if you get caught using one of these or just keep left them off. Sometimes, people say, well, why would you want to do this? And it turns out, if you've got smart teenagers, they might not want you to know what they're doing. You might have a spouse who doesn't want to know what they're doing. Doctors don't want to know what they're doing with the company vehicle after hours. And there's all sorts of different reasons why people buy these devices. Turns out organized crime, stealing cars. You probably heard that car theft in Ontario, outside of Toronto. All sorts of cars are being stolen in the area of Port of Montreal and in Port of Halifax, where they're testing. Well, this is one of the first steps. The step before that is you phone key fob. You come up with a way of getting into the car. Once you're in the car, then you create your own key fob so you can start the car and away you go. But most people have got some kind of tracking system in their vehicle, OnStar or whatever. So the first thing that car thieves do is they stick that into the cigarette lighter. They go and park that stolen car in some quiet spot for 3 or 4 days to make sure it doesn't have anything. Then they go and stick that to the flash light, and the car can pick that up and take it to the Port of Montreal, Port of Halifax. But this is part of that chain. And this happened when I was working down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was a great water cooler talk because the FAA was trying to certify a system, and anytime you try to certify a system for aviation, the good news is they got some really strict parameters to trying to get that system qualified. But as it turned out, there was this interference thing that happened, and they thought initially, it's coming from the airport. Somewhere here, we're going to find it. Eventually, it set up some sensors, and this is happening like at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day. And then eventually they went, this is happening a lot. And then eventually, they caught this guy in 2012, and the FAA, the FCC, the U.S., they agreed to fuck with this guy. Initially, they were going to fine him about $45,000 US, and they dropped that down to around $32,000. And he was just using the company's stuff. He also lost his job. This is what I did when I was down at White Sands for 4 years. On the bottom left, dual frequency camera, so you got 2 antennas because the military signals are on L1 and L2. We're picking out lots of power, so unlike this guy that runs off your cigarette lighter, you've got a generator that you tow up there with your Ford truck. All the electronics that you use for jamming are inside that little tank. And you saw the Oppenheimer movie. That's the site of where the Trinity explosion took place. And it's inside a fenced area, but when we're down there, we usually try to get a shot of it at that site. So we have limited access, but we have a chance to get some pictures. D&D, because in Canada, we're limited to put out, we have to put an attenuator in here to make the power even less than what they put that to do testing in Canada. And I mentioned in the U.S., we can pick out a lot of power, as long as you have to get everybody's on board. And so that's why D&D, with our vehicles at its early stage, where our experts are, is what we call navigation warfare. They strip their vehicles down with different detection systems and fancy antennas that try to put a null, get rid of the jamming, all sorts of different technologies to affect the side channel that they're down of White Sands. Oh, I'll be back. This is my link to Space Debris and GPS. So this is a GPS scanning antenna, but these antennas over here that look like little domes, those are part of the U.S. Space Surveillance Network. So with some telescopes that are at White Sands, this happens to be nothing and not looking down to the part of the scale. When I was working in New Mexico, I had a chance to do a jamming trial in Norway. This is the Norwegians. They set up the jammer, and you can see the camouflage netting. Where the J is in jamming, you can see the antenna poking up through the camouflage netting. That was for training NATO forces, ISR's intelligence surveillance at the time. So it was one of those ISR type trials, and one of the first trials I know of where we did a bunch of jamming for NATO forces so they could get the experience of not just anything position, but what happens when you lose all your communication. Because communications, especially working ones, rely on GPS communication. This jammer on the right, made by Novotel, well-recognized company in Canada, Calgary. They make GPS receivers, really, really good one. But for D&D, they built us this handheld jammer. You can jam both the civilian and the military signals with. Relatively low power to meet industry Canada's rules. You can see one of the jamming signals is really, really weak, just above the noise score there a little bit. and we use that on the range. It's like a piece of test equipment, but we can also take it out onto the military operations and train our soldiers, sailors, airmen. What's the effect of using a GPS signals at a relatively short range? Great little device, though, and you can see it on the tripod. This was, I think, from 2015 when I was starting to grow my hair. That's it on a tripod. And then what we did was we used that meat as our reference, or as our baseline. And then we would use these jammers, I call them eBay jammers, that you go buy online, with the attenuators, lowering the signal level down. Imagine if these devices are out there, not with an attenuator, that's where we get into that 1 kilometer, 5 kilometers. I own a unit in the bottom center, and that's the system I did for finding GPS interference. So it's a directional device, and you can see it's got a little red and yellow lights there. And as you get closer to the jamming signal or the interference signal, you can track it down using that. So it's a handy piece of equipment to look at interference. It doesn't have to be an intentional jammer. It could just be some kind of interference like that. But handy little device, not but great for going out and finding GPS interference. I'm going to switch into now GPS spoofing. Now, I mentioned GPS jamming. That's where you just have some kind of signal, put a bunch of noise in the GPS packet. Spoofing, that's another whole kettle of fish. I don't know what a good expression is. Somebody help me out. But what you do is you use a GPS simulator, one way of doing it, and you create simulated GPS signals. So you can take the date, you can take the time, and you can take the location. And you make somebody think there's somewhere there. That's GPS spoofing. When we do GPS spoofing, often what we do is we whack the jammer, start making the receiver, so that can try to reacquire the satellite. And while you're trying to reacquire the satellite, you bump up the power on the jammer, on the spoofing signal, and you take away, kind of like this. So we've got our noise level down here, and then we've got a GPS signal that's kind of in here. And what we do is we slap a jammer on here, and then we've got our GPS spoofer a little bit higher up here. And then we take the jammer away, and it's left with just spoofing. Kind of like that. Whereas the GPS signal is still down here. So in the early days, we were able to detect spoofing. You got a great signal with lots of power, way more than you need to. Novotel, and it's Canadian company that makes GPS spoofing, they do a lot of work in trying to figure out and identify is it a spoofing signal. Is it a real, a MREP? Is it a real thing, or is it a fake? That's GPS spoofing. It really came into the news in about 2011 because Iran put this all out into the news. They captured a U.S. drone. It's called an RQ-177. Initially, the U.S. said, yeah, no. Then President Obama eventually said, you can have a drone back. And Iran said no. And a few years later, Iran was flying phones that left almost identical. So from the CIA's perspective, a bit of a bad news. Right? Again, 2011, back when I was working down in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A guy by the name of Todd Humphrey, a professor at the University of Texas in Austin, world recognized now on spoofing. And what he did in 2012 is he said, let's just prove how easy it is to do that. And this was, in the unclassified division. So he was I think it's pretty easy to do, so he went off and he did it. And he happened to do it down at White House Missile Range in 2012. And he put this drone in his spoofed location, but he also actually spoofed it. He took control of the drone. He did his own thing with the drone. So Todd Humphreys, if you haven't checked out how to fool a GPS, TED Talk, and you can find out a YouTube video on how to kind of mess up a GPS system. In 2017, a guy by the name of Mike Jones, who wrote Banner Research, just showed up in an article in GPS World. It's a periodical and magazine. You can go online and you can find this article now digitally. And if you do that, you can then go to the link from that to talk all about a bunch of ships in the Black Sea that had their position pulled. So instead of saying where they really were, there's a 6-year system called AIS. which broadcasted GPS position. So while the ships around know where the ships are. Now the problem was they were all reporting their position at an airport as opposed to out in the water. Right? Now, if we go back to 1997, you might remember a movie called Tomorrow Never Dies, James Bond movie. That was when I was in my master's thesis, and working in the LD lab, the electrical engineering lab, doing my jamming and spoofing stuff. And everyone found this quite entertaining because it was in a movie. You know, what are the things that happen? For my master's thesis, I showed how you could take GPS receiver and walk the receiver off over Gulf Water. It was perfectly crazy. Initially, the U.S. folks who were my thesis advisors had research people come over and say, okay, this thesis has to be classified. I said, yeah, I'm going to work off the equipment. Yeah, anybody coming out of a U.S. military facility, you know, any other civilian university could do this very thing. There's nothing special about what I'm doing. So it got published because it would have been really bad news, especially for my sponsor in Winnipeg, if I had said, that thesis I was working on, yeah, it's no foreign. It can't be released to Canada. So thankfully it was. But that may be kind of a glimpse into what GPS spoofing is going to be about. No one ever died, in James Bond coming to rescue. If you do a Google search today on GPS spoofing in the Middle East, you'll find all sorts of interesting references. You might have seen Briar Stewart's article in CBC just a few weeks ago, and she talked about this ongoing problem. And this is a slide on the left is one that I used out my briefing in Calgary about 6 weeks ago. So it's a little dated, but it's pretty much the same slide if you look at it every day. So if you just go to gpsjam.org, that name will pop up, and it'll show you the state of GPS jamming and spoofing going on in the world. Wherever there are airplanes, if any of you have an app called Flight Radar 24, what it does is it transmits GPS information. And most of it just go, hey, when's my airplane arriving, or when's your daughter flying in, or something like that. Maybe. Or if you're like me, you're out at the cottage, and you look up and see an airplane flying over on the way to Halifax. So, okay, which airport is that? Or which airplane is that? You know, it's a Porter flight coming in. It's 1987. Great little app that you have for. But in that data is the quality of the GPS signal. So a guy by the name of John Wiseman said, hey, I know where the airplanes are, and I know the quality of the GPS signal. I'm just going to create what we call a heat map. You know, create a bunch of sort of hexagons, geographically, and go low, medium, and high. And that's what you've got is this daily plot of GPS interference and jamming and spoofing going on. You can see there's not much happening in Ukraine and Syria because there's no airplanes flying over it. Broadcasting is on. Not to say there's not stuff going on in those two areas. It's just that there are no airplanes transmitting the signals down and it's down to the jamming. And, you look at this kind of what not very much. Yeah, they're trying to figure out it's like that. They're trying to figure it out. And because by the step, you'll see that in Texas is still coming up with some events in the in the bottom left, in the top left, that's the system that I use for jamming GPS signals faster. Probably cost about $100,000 to buy that system off the shelf back in the day. Really good, but really expensive. But it did the trick in terms of jamming and spoofing signals using most optical hardware, I might add. And in 2015, this was a system that I developed, sort of business on the side, and a hobby side business. I put together a bunch of hardware that could go find GPS, including that device I showed you. And the problem I had is, what I really need is test my system. Really? Because I have a really good relationship with industry channels. At least I think I do. By not having a real one. This is not a real GPS jam. It doesn't have any electronics. That little square box that you see there, this just lights up when you plug it in. There's nothing in there except the light. But it makes a great training game. Because the second thing was I needed to create my own artificial GPS interference signals for testing. which is what my paper presentation in Montreal was looking at. Very long, very technical. Basically what I did was I took two devices, which are in my briefcase, if you want to see them, and I create a carrier, and I create a jamming waveform, I create whatever kind of jamming signals that I want. And this is 8 different jamming signals into this kind of U-block UPS receiver with that many on. And so that U-block, you see those in little drones people fly, the quadcopters. So by this kind of testing, I can tell you which is the best kind of signal to jam a drone. So that's kind of the image that I'm working on here. So not using these, but homemade interference signals that are lower power, even if you can have. And that's kind of just an example of some of the jamming signals or simulation signals that I see. If you Google GPS, RFI, simulation, you'll find a link to that too, fairly high in Google. The bottom right one is a signal I created for the Russian drone. Again, low power stuff that you can use. Because our cell phone, right, is GPS, GLONASS, Galileo, and Baby, I need to be able to create the signals to jam it all. So that's pretty much it. Let me give you kind of an idea of some of the factors like space, weather, and orbit. Kind of speed, you got to put something into orbit at, you have to get it up there about 8 kilometers a second. You kind of run a debris that's out there, over 29,000 objects, and they're this size and bigger, so they're tracked routinely, and you try to make sure one doesn't run into the other. The whole idea of doing space surveillance. And then a little bit about GPS, and hopefully not too technical, but enough maybe to just whet the technical appetite for a few of you. Give us with the question. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. No, I think a really good example of that was the end of January. So the question was about space weather and predicting space weather. Yeah. There is, for any of you that like the Northern Lights, there's a website called Space Weather Prediction Center, SWC, I think that right? SWC. That they have that the NOAA, National Oceanic, NOAA has that website, and they put that out, and so they'll tell you all sorts of what's happening with the space environment. But it's space weather prediction, and so they'll do a really good job of saying this is when the Northern Lights are going to be most likely in the week, and when we get these large Q3, Q4 level storms, it tends to have that Northern Lights kind of work their way down. What they found was that end of January, beginning of February in 2022, when SpaceX lost those 38 satellites and 49 satellites, it was kind of back to the drawing board. Because just like the hurricane prediction, and you show all the different models that say, how bad is it going to be with hurricane 60 coast. It's kind of like that with space weather. They have different models that they use, and so they have to kind of come up with. They're going to have to go back to the drawing board a little bit for that one to happen back in 2022. Yeah. Really important. In terms of space debris, they call it a conjunction analysis. That's just the term that space is. The question was on space debris and launching into space and making sure that you don't launch right up into space debris. So the term is conjunction analysis, and the U.S. runs the prediction, and usually what they're looking for is satellites that are working to make sure some other piece of space debris doesn't hit that. But normally they don't do a conjunction for debris. They're running a conjunction for something important, like the space station in particular. The space station is like this huge kind of football-shaped dome around it. It's kind of a protection area. And it's the same idea when they want to launch something into space. You don't want to have a piece of space debris run into it. Yeah, when does space become dangerous? A good example is, I didn't have that slide in here to fit in, but a speck of paint traveling at 8 kilometers a second hits the space shuttle's window, and the space shuttle window is, well, had, I think, 3 layers to it, and just a speck of paint would do that. So would cause kind of like a gravel sedge in the wind. So because it's got so much momentum, because even though it's so small, it's got a lot of energy when it runs into things. Other things is, other part of that too is, you've got a satellite going around. You've got a satellite going around the Earth this way, but then you might have another satellite going around the Earth this way. So one guy's going 7.5 kilometers a second this way. Another guy going 7.5 kilometers a second this way. Opposing speed, you're giving up around 14 kilometers. So when it's kind of like a 4-way stop, you're both going, hey, I'm traveling 7 kilometers a second, you're traveling 70 kilometers a second. What's the chance that we're going to run into each other, right? But when you do, it's a problem. And so that's why it's so challenging, too, when you think about how fast objects in space are traveling and trying to predict with some certain level of accuracy. Because you don't necessarily want to move the space station. You don't have to, but on the other hand. Another part of it, too, is like the Sapphire satellite works on, does not have any onboard propulsion system. So if there was something that's going to run into it, there's not too much you can do about it. You might your spacecraft a little bit, but whereas other satellites, like the Canadian radar satellites that are in space, they've got onboard propulsion, so they've been maneuvered numerous times because of space debris. They're really high-value assets in terms of security. Satellites in space, so that's something to see. Okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I guess I'm not just quite sure where I'd go with that. The question is on over the horizon position. I mean, GPS itself, we're talking about GPS. Those satellites are out at 20,000 kilometers. I showed you that slide in the bright yellow where they live. Well, yeah, I guess I'm really not sure, but I'm really not sure about the question. Oh, encryption is good, and that's why the military GPS signals are encrypted. If the civilian ones are not, for GPS. Yeah, so a question on encryption and the GPS signal. I hung up. Yeah. Back to that side. So I wasn't going to go into this too much, but the way the GPS signal kind of works is you've got a carrier, and then you've got a ranging code on it. And that ranging code is how you measure your range. You know when it left the satellite and when it arrived. You can measure that. The close acquisition signal is not encrypted. So if you use a GPS receiver, you can use AD2, whereas the military signals have another layer on top of that ranging. It makes it encrypted, which means you can't get people going encrypted. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's impossible. Yeah. Sorry, I was going to go here first. the accuracy of the clock. I use the COVID answer, right? 6 feet, about 1 foot, and the time it takes signals to travel, 1 foot is about 1 nanosecond. We can convert that to meters, so we don't have to do meters. But the speed of light, or the speed of an RF signal, is about 1 foot per every nanosecond. So if you want to be able to measure your altitude in terms of your position, that's why the clock in your phone or your GPS receiver needs to have that fourth satellite installed for that to get it down to those kind of nanoseconds. I think the 5G network is something like about a 50 nanosecond accuracy just to get away from the 5G network. How the clock is built? Well, the clock on your phone, it fits really badly. That's why we do that. The whole business of space cancer is another whole country. Yeah, so most airplane navigation systems don't just have GPS. And that's why I showed you that slide of GPS off the coast of Malaysia. So airplanes can lose their GPS system and make that what we call an inertial navigation system. A combination of gyros and accelerometers. And wherever your GPS position was, in theory, it stopped working and goes. My inertials will now carry me through to where I got to go. The danger is if that system gets boost before the inertials sort of take over. So you've got your GPS, you've got your inertials, and they're very tightly integrated. But if you fool the GPS and the inertial solution also gets fooled, then even though you think you might not be there, your inertial is just trying to pick up the pieces with a bad starting point. So, but yeah, inertial navigation system, that's kind of how the pilots can fight through that and operate the system. If it was just So the good news about your cell phone is it also gets time synchronization from the cellular network. So as long as the cell network hasn't had this synchronization reached up, if you just have your cell phone and you lose your GPS, the good news is your cell phone now uses GPS. GPS1, chances are Justin redundancy in your overall phone is like you're going to jam something, jam out. Yeah. Oh, it's a scale of 1 to 5. So the G5 level that we had was on, I think the low end of the G5 scale. Kind of back to the question we had at the beginning of space weather prediction. I think it was 89, we had a big outage in Quebec. And because of solar storm, the way I remember it was, we got all these hydro lines, and they're like big antennas, and so you've got all this magnetic stuff happening, and you get current built up into the hydro line, which then can blow out transformers. And as soon as you start blowing out transformers, things get overloaded, and the time has this common and all that. So that kind of answers it, but systems are designed much better to handle it. I talked about the vulnerability. There's a thing called phasor measurement in music. And phasor measurement rely very precisely on the phase of the signal. They use that system. After the 89 incident, they said, hey, you could use GPS for CME. So now with scam GPS, you can mess up our phase measurement units used in electrical grid. So the electrical grid is vulnerable in the sense of the phasor measurement unit. So yeah, the international cooperation, there are different organizations. One of the big ones right now is the High Court of State because there's nothing that's legislated that says, internationally you have to do this or something like the U.S. When your satellite stops working, you can't just leave it in space. You have to have some kind of plan to deorbit this thing. And remember Eric said this today. If you have a satellite like this and it's up at 400 kilometers, it's just out of the International Space Station. You saw that it took 3 years for that 6,000-pound block of batteries to come back to Earth. Well, when the guys at when the engineers and the science Dalhousie, what they did is they designed the solar panels so they would flip up. And what that does is it creates more drag on the spacecraft. And so when you're done using the spacecraft, these extra solar panels created more drag on the Dalhousie satellite home stage. So there's things that are being done to try to improve getting rid of space debris. In low Earth orbit, things are pretty good because you get those solar events that kind of clean up from modern. The problem is when you get up to GPS altitude, geostationary altitude, it takes way too much fuel and propellant to bring that back to Earth. It's far easier to just go bump it up a little bit higher. And eventually we're going to kind of run into some problems because that geostationary we're doing 35,000. It's going to start to get kind of cluttered up and stuff that's just about that. But down in the low end, space environment will kind of clean up. Just to give you a kind of rough idea, at an altitude of about 1,000 kilometers, it takes about 1,000 years to come back there. And as you come down, it gets beat up. And so a good example is the space station is that piece of space. The space station is frequently boosted in altitude. Because if it wasn't, it's like a football size from the center. It wouldn't take long for the space station to come back there. Which it will. Whenever they decide to stop using space stations, it will come back there and bring up mostly on the space. Yeah. A good example would be the folks in 2001. The example is when we had for GPS interference. A good example is something completely unintentional, where somebody just got electronic products that putting out unintentional interference signals because there happens to be some harmonic default into the GPS package. That's a really good use of that device. And then if you had someone like a trucker that's using a GPS jammer, the thing with truckers is you'd have to sit in there, they kind of drive by. So the effect of the jamming signal doesn't last that long because it's only got a range of about a kilometer and it goes in by the end of the airport of Halifax. So you have to, worst case is the airplane just coming into land at the same time the stuff's going by. NAV Canada, Industry Canada, CRC, different government organizations working with York University. They did a study a few years ago, and they put a GPS interference monitoring system, you can buy different ones, and they located it at a certain spot, one in Montreal, one in Ottawa, and one in Vancouver. And the results of that study were done, and the preliminary findings of that were in a research paper last fall. So there's work being done on that, and you can see from their preliminary analysis that there's lots of truckers driving by. It ends up only being maybe a few minutes of interference that might really cause a problem. So in the big picture, not the biggest problem, it's only maybe a few minutes go by real fast. It's just the question is it going to get worse? And at some point, when there's unique to Canada, and that's going to have to kind of step in and nail that guy who's stuck with his family. But in the big picture, it's not necessarily a big problem, but having that kind of piece of equipment to go and try to find that. Yeah. Okay. Now, I think that's mainly just the software that's in the device. And you can have settings in there that say, take me to shortest speed or take me to fastest speed. And yeah, so you could probably just change it from fastest to shortest speed to, anyway. Yeah, yeah. I mean, the one that I brought along here is my own design for the features again. But yeah, yeah, it depends on the setting. Right?